female warriors of history, rediscovering the legendary Dahomey Amazons of West Africa. When the drums begin to breathe, it usually starts with silence, not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, waiting kind. The sort of silence that settles over red earth just before dawn, when the air is thick, the insects slow down, and even the trees seem to hold their breath. Somewhere in the distance, a drum sounds, low, measured, not rushed, because there is no need to rush. Everyone already knows what comes next. This is not a story that begins in Europe. There are no stone castles here, no knights in polished armor, no romantic myths carved into marble centuries later. This story begins in West Africa, in a land where the heat presses against your skin like a second body, where power is measured not by titles, but by survival, and where history learned early on that it had underestimated women. Again, tonight, we walk into the kingdom of Dahomey, and we do not walk alone. We march alongside the Mino, the women the world would later call the Dahomey Amazons, mostly because Europeans, upon seeing disciplined female soldiers who did not ask permission to exist, immediately reached for a myth they half remembered from Greek texts. Because of course they did. Naming something familiar is easier than understanding it. But the Mino were not myths. They were real. They bled. They trained. They fought. And they terrified the people who assumed they shouldn't be able to do any of those things. Imagine the sound first. Bare feet striking packed earth in perfect rhythm. Spears knocking softly against shields. The low chant of voices trained to breathe together. Not singing, not shouting, something in between. Something that steadies the heart and reminds the body what it is meant to do. The sun rises slowly, and as it does, rows of women emerge from the haze, uniform, focused, unapologetic. This is not spectacle. This is routine. Dahomey, long before it became a cautionary footnote in colonial archives, was a kingdom built on discipline. It did not survive by accident. Located in what is now southern Benin, Dahomey existed in a region shaped by trade, conflict, shifting alliances, and the constant pressure of stronger neighbors. Survival here demanded structure, and Dahomey was very, very structured. The king sat at the center of power, but he was never alone. Around him existed a complex bureaucracy, a rigid court culture, and an understanding that authority had to be enforced daily, not assumed. This was not a place where rulers could afford weakness, which may explain why, at some point, someone made a decision that would confuse European observers for centuries. They armed women. At first, it was practical. It always is. The earliest versions of the Mino were likely royal guards, tasked with protecting the palace and the king himself, hunting units, enforcers of court authority, roles that required loyalty, physical endurance, and an ability to act without hesitation, qualities Dahomey found quite reliably in women. And once that door opened, it never closed again. Training was brutal. Not because Dahomey was uniquely cruel, but because war does not forgive softness. Recruits were often young. Some volunteered, others were selected. Some were sent by families who saw military service as both honor and survival. Once inside, they were remade. They ran barefoot over thorns until pain became background noise. They climbed walls slick with mud and blood. They practiced mock executions to erase hesitation. They learned to fight in formation, to move as one body, to obey commands without panic. Emotion was not eliminated, but it was controlled. Fear was acknowledged, then disciplined into usefulness. Sleep was scarce. Food was measured. Mistakes were corrected immediately. And through it all, something unusual happened. These women were not trained to support male soldiers. They were trained to replace them. By the 18th century, the Mino were no longer ceremonial. They were no longer symbolic. They were frontline infantry, shock troops, the first wave, the last stand. When Dahomey went to war, the Mino marched with them, sometimes ahead of them. European traders and missionaries wrote about them obsessively, their accounts dripping with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. They described the women as unfeminine, savage, unnatural, which tells us more about European expectations than about Dahomey's reality. Because from the Dahomey perspective, the question was never whether women could fight, the question was whether they would fight well. And they did. Their weapons evolved with time. Early on, spears and machetes dominated. Later, muskets. Eventually, modern firearms taken from defeated enemies or acquired through trade. Training adapted, tactics sharpened. The Mino learned to advance under fire, to flank, to retreat without breaking. Formation, they learned when to scream and when to stay silent. And they learned something else too: identity. The Mino were not wives, they were not mothers, they were not available. Their lives belonged to the state, to the king, to each other. This separation was not a punishment, it was a transformation. They existed outside the social roles that defined most women of the time, and in doing so, they gained something rare: autonomy. That autonomy came at a cost. The expectations were absolute. Cowardice was unforgivable. Desertion, unthinkable. Honor was collective, not individual. If one faltered, all bore the shame. So they did not falter. By the time colonial powers began pressing inward, armed with rifles, treaties written in languages Dahomey did not use, and the unshakable belief that African kingdoms were temporary obstacles rather than civilizations, they encountered something unexpected: women who refused to step aside. The French would later describe battles against Dahomey as chaotic, brutal, and deeply unsettling. Not because they were losing, at least not always, but because the rules they thought governed warfare did not apply here. The Mino charged directly into firegun. They closed distance fast. They fought hand-to-hand when ammunition ran out, and they did it without hesitation. This was not desperation. This was doctrine. And somewhere in the humid air, beneath the gun smoke and the shouted orders, the drums kept breathing. Slow, steady, unimpressed by empire. This is only the beginning. The kingdom that learned to stand upright. Before we follow the Mino any further into battle, we need to understand the ground beneath their feet. Not just the red earth, warm even before the sun fully commits to the day, but the political and cultural soil that made something like them possible in the first place. Because elite female soldiers do not appear by accident. They emerge when a society decides, consciously or not, that survival matters more than tradition. The kingdom of Dahomey was never a passive place. It sat in a region shaped by movement, trade routes crossing forests and coastlines, neighboring states rising and collapsing with exhausting regularity, empires breathing in and out like tides. Dahomey learned early that neutrality was a luxury it could not afford. Power here was centralized, ritualized, and relentlessly enforced. The king was not just a ruler, he was the living symbol of the state. His body mattered, his safety mattered, his authority had to feel inevitable. And to make authority feel inevitable, you needed more than words. You needed discipline that seeped into daily life. The Dahomeyan court was precise to the point of obsession. Ceremonies were layered with meaning. Rank was visible in posture, in dress, in who was allowed to speak and when. Even silence had rules. This was not chaos, it was control, sharpened by centuries of pressure. And within this system, gender roles were practical rather than sentimental. Men hunted, traded, fought. Women farmed, administered markets, managed households. But these were not rigid walls, they were lanes, and when a lane stopped working, Dahomey changed it, quietly, without apology. The earliest Mino units likely began as hunters, elephant hunters specifically, dangerous work, requiring patience, coordination, and a tolerance for risk that not everyone possessed. Over time, these women were pulled closer to the palace, closer to power, because someone noticed something important. They did not panic. From palace guards, they became enforcers. From enforcers, soldiers. Each transition felt logical inside Dahomey, even if it felt shocking to outsiders. The state needed loyal warriors who were not entangled in local clan politics, not distracted by family obligations, not tempted by competing loyalties. Women fit that requirement disturbingly well. By separating the Mino from conventional social roles, Dahomey created something rare, a professional military class that belonged entirely to the state. Their barracks were near the palace, their lives structured by drills, rituals, and shared identity. They did not inherit their status, they earned it daily. And this is where the rhythm of their lives settles in. Imagine dusk in Dahomey, the Dahomey capital. Smoke rises from cooking fires. The air smells of palm oil and earth and iron. Somewhere behind the palace walls, the Mino assemble. Weapons cleaned, blades inspected. No chatter, no unnecessary movement. The day is not over until discipline says it is. Training never really stops. Strength is maintained, formation rehearsed, commands repeated until response becomes instinct. The Mino trained to advance without breaking stride, even when the person next to them fell, especially when the person next to them fell, because the formation mattered more than the individual. This was not cruelty for its own sake, it was preparation. War in West Africa was fast, close, and personal. Battles did not stretch politely across open fields. They crashed into villages, forests, narrow paths, where hesitation meant death. The Mino were trained for proximity, for noise, for chaos. They learned to shout not out of fear, but to unnerve, to overwhelm, to remind their enemies that retreat was still an option many wisely took. European observers struggled to categorize what they saw. They described the Mino as wives of the king, as concubines, as religious fanatics, anything but soldiers, because acknowledging them as soldiers meant acknowledging that the rules Europeans assumed were universal were not. The irony, of course, is that the Mino themselves were not trying to make a statement about gender. They were doing a job, and doing it extremely well. As Dahomey expanded, so did their role. Raids, defensive campaigns, border enforcement. The Mino marched with drums and banners, not as mascots, but as units with clear tactical purpose. Some specialized in marksmanship, others in shock assault, others in reconnaissance, and always discipline. Failure carried consequences, success carried recognition. Songs were written, names remembered. But personal glory was discouraged. The unit came first. The kingdom came before everything. This culture created something dangerous to colonial ambitions, a population that believed in its own strength, a military that did not crumble under pressure, and women who did not see submission as destiny. By the early 19th century, European powers had shifted from trading partners to would-be masters. Treaties were proposed, boundaries redrawn on paper far away, demands made with the casual confidence of people who assumed resistance would be brief. They were wrong. The first clashes were not massive wars. They were tests, probes, attempts to measure Dahomey's resolve, and each time the response was immediate, organized, violent, personal. When the world arrives with paper and guns, history has a way of announcing itself politely before it turns violent. It arrives first as a conversation, then as a document, then, eventually, as smoke. By the middle of the 19th century, Dahomey could feel the pressure building long before the first major battles began. European ships appeared more frequently along the coast. Their flags changed more often than their intentions. Traders became officials. Officials became negotiators. Negotiators became men with maps, insisting that lines drawn far away mattered more than realities on the ground. This was the moment when the old rhythms began to clash with new ones. For Dahomey, the world was lived, not abstracted. Authority was visible, loyalty was personal, land was held through force, ritual, and memory. For the French, representing France, power was increasingly bureaucratic, claimed through treaties, justified by paperwork, enforced by rifles manufactured far from the forests they would soon tear apart. Neither side fully understood the other, and neither side trusted the other enough to try very hard. At first, there were agreements, coastal ports placed under protection, trade arrangements that favored one side more than the other, promises that sounded cooperative but felt to Dahomey like slow suffocation. Each signature narrowed the kingdom's freedom just a little more. Each concession came with expectations of further obedience. The Mino watched all of this from inside the palace walls. They were not diplomats, but they understood patterns. They understood pressure, and they understood when something was being taken rather than shared. When conflict finally arrived, it did not come as a single, dramatic declaration of war. It came in stages, small clashes, disputed authority, a village here, a road there. Each incident framed by the French as enforcement, each response by Dahomey framed as resistance. And resistance was something the Mino knew intimately. By now, they were no longer an unusual feature of the Dahomeyan military. They were its backbone, thousands strong, organized into regiments with clear command structures, armed with muskets alongside traditional blades, trained to fight in terrain that did not favor European formations. But the world had changed. French forces brought artillery, rapid-fire weapons, supply lines backed by industrial capacity. This was not the kind of warfare Dahomey had faced before. Courage could still close distance, but distance closed faster now, chewed up by metal and noise. The first major confrontations were brutal and confusing. The Mino advanced as they always had, formations tight, movements deliberate. They charged through smoke and gunfire, shouting, firing, pushing forward with the same doctrine that had served them for generations. And sometimes it worked. French soldiers later admitted, often reluctantly, that the Mino fought with extraordinary discipline, that they did not flee under fire, that they continued advancing even after sustaining losses that would have broken other units. Officers wrote of the shock of seeing women rise from smoke, weapons raised, faces set with absolute resolute. But artillery does not care about resolve. Cannons tore gaps through formations faster than they could be closed. Rifles fired faster than muskets could reload. The battlefield itself had shifted from something you could dominate through proximity to something that punished it. Still, the Mino adapted. They learned to use cover, to ambush, to retreat in order rather than collapse. They studied their enemy just as they always had. But adaptation takes time, and time was no longer on their side. One of the most devastating aspects of this conflict was not the fighting itself, but the realization that bravery was no longer enough, that discipline, however perfect, could be overwhelmed by technology designed for conquest on a global scale. For the Mino, this was not just military defeat, it was existential. Their identity was bound to effectiveness, to the idea that they could protect the kingdom through force of will and unity. Watching that foundation crack was disorienting in a way no training could prepare them for. Battles near Dahomey grew fiercer, casualties mounted. Songs once sung before marches grew quieter, heavier. The drums still played, but their rhythm slowed, not from weakness, but from exhaustion. And yet, even as defeat loomed, surrender was never immediate. The Mino continued to fight because stopping was unthinkable, because their lives had been shaped entirely around resistance, because stepping aside would mean acknowledging that the world now belonged to someone else. French reports from this period are filled with contradictions, admiration laced with condescension, fear disguised as moral judgment. They described the Mino as fanatical, as unnatural, as tragic relics of a dying order. Rarely did they describe them simply as soldiers, because doing so would have required respect. Eventually, the outcome became inevitable. Dahomey could not outproduce Europe, could not replace losses fast enough, could not hold territory against sustained bombardment. The capital fell. The kingdom was absorbed into the expanding colonial system, its sovereignty reduced to administrative language and foreign oversight. For the Mino, the end did not arrive as a single moment. It arrived as disbandment, as silence, as orders that no longer came, as weapons taken away not in battle, but in ceremony. Some were absorbed into colonial structures. Some returned to civilian life they barely recognized. Some disappeared from written records entirely, their stories surviving only in memory and oral tradition. And this is where history usually moves on. Empires fall, kingdoms fade. The narrative closes neatly as if something essential has been resolved. But endings are rarely that clean, especially when the people involved refused until the very last moment to stop standing upright. After the drums fell silent. Conquest is loud. Occupation is quiet. After Dahomey fell and the banners were lowered, the noise faded first. No more war drums marking the morning, no chants echoing through training grounds, just the ordinary sounds of survival returning, awkwardly, like people stepping back into a room after an argument that ended something important. Colonial rule does not usually announce itself with constant violence. That would be exhausting. Instead, it settles in with paperwork, uniforms, new laws posted on walls no one asked to read. In what the French now called Benin, the old systems were dismantled piece by piece. Courts replaced palaces, administrators replaced kings. Memory was not outlawed, but it was discouraged, which is often more effective. For the former Mino, this was a strange kind of defeat. They had trained their entire lives to exist inside structure, hierarchy, and purpose. Now they were told those identities no longer applied. Their weapons were taken, their formations dissolved, their loyalty, once the foundation of the state, was suddenly inconvenient. Some returned to farming, some married, some lived quietly in villages that did not fully understand what they had been. Others refused to speak about it at all, not out of shame, but because there were no words that fit anymore. Colonial narratives did their work efficiently. French textbooks framed the wars as pacification campaigns. Resistance was minimized. The Mino were described as curiosities, footnotes, exaggerations. Stories written by people who survived the battles were dismissed as folklore. After all, women soldiers made for uncomfortable facts. And so, the silence stretched. Decades passed, empires weakened, borders shifted again, independence came, eventually, as it always does, though never in the way anyone expects. And with independence came a question that lingers after every colonial withdrawal. What exactly did we lose? For a long time, the answer avoided the Mino. Post-colonial states often focused on modern identity, on unity, on moving forward. Dwelling on militarized pasts, especially those that did not fit clean narratives, felt risky. The women remained in songs, in oral histories, in fragments passed quietly from one generation to the next. Then, historians started asking better questions, not louder ones, better ones. They returned to archives, reread colonial reports with skepticism, compared oral histories with military records, and slowly the picture sharpened. The Mino were no longer myths or exaggerations. They were units, regiments, strategically deployed soldiers operating within a highly organized state. This rediscovery did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually, the way real understanding usually does, through careful work, through patience, through the uncomfortable realization that entire chapters of history had been minimized because they challenged assumptions that felt easier to keep. The world outside West Africa began to notice. Articles were written, documentaries filmed, museums re-examined artifacts once labeled incorrectly or ignored entirely, and popular culture, as it tends to do, arrived late but loudly. Suddenly, the Dahomey Amazons were everywhere, reframed, reimagined, sometimes honored, sometimes simplified, sometimes turned into symbols rather than people, which is progress of a sort, though never the final kind. The danger of rediscovery is spectacle, turning lived experience into aesthetic, strength into branding, complexity into slogans. The Mino deserve better than that. They were not superheroes, they were not flawless, they were soldiers shaped by a state that demanded everything from them and gave them identity in return. They lived in a world where violence was ordinary and survival required adaptation. Their choices were constrained, their discipline unforgiving, their courage real. And that reality matters. Because when we tell their story honestly, something shifts. The idea that women in pre-colonial Africa were passive collapses. The assumption that military professionalism belongs to Europe dissolves. The myth that colonial conquest was inevitable feels weaker. The Mino remind us that history is not a straight line toward progress. It is a series of choices, many of them made under pressure, some of them lost not because they failed, but because someone else wrote over them. The long night after history speaks. By the time the story reaches this point, the night is usually very quiet. Not empty, just still. The kind of stillness where you can hear your own breathing again after hours of drums and marching and gunfire echoing through memory. This is where the Mino remain now, not in battle lines, not in archives alone, but in that quiet space history enters when it finally stops arguing with itself. They were not an anomaly. That is the first thing worth remembering. The Mino did not exist outside history's rules. They existed because of them, because states under pressure adapt, because power reorganizes itself when survival demands it, because societies that last do not cling to what feels familiar, they cling to what works. The Mino worked. They remind us that warfare has never been a single story, that professionalism does not wear one uniform, that courage does not sound the same in every place, and that discipline, when internalized deeply enough, can outlast even the state that created it. What lingers most, perhaps, is not their violence, but their clarity. The Mino knew who they were. They knew their role. They understood the cost of belonging to something larger than themselves and paid it daily without asking for applause. They did not fight to prove a point about gender. They fought because that was their duty, in a world where duty was not negotiable. There is something unsettling about that kind of certainty. It challenges modern instincts that insist identity must always be chosen freely, continuously redefined, endlessly debated. The Mino did not debate who they were, they trained. And when the world changed faster than they could adapt, they did not vanish because they were weak. They vanished because history is often written by those who prefer clean endings. Colonial rules favored narratives that explained conquest as destiny rather than collision, and the Mino did not fit neatly into destiny. So they were softened, then simplified, then ignored, until they weren't. Today, their story returns unevenly, sometimes thoughtfully, sometimes clumsily, sometimes as inspiration, sometimes as costume. That tension is part of remembrance. Recovery is rarely graceful, but it is necessary. Because forgetting them was never neutral. It supported a version of history where African states were always behind, where women were always secondary, where resistance was always futile. The Mino quietly dismantle all three assumptions without raising their voices. And maybe that is their final lesson. That power does not always announce itself loudly, that discipline does not need validation, that entire histories can survive in memory long enough to reemerge when the world grows curious enough to ask better questions. If you listen carefully now, you might imagine the drums again, not calling soldiers to form ranks, just marking time, slow, steady, unconcerned with whether anyone is paying attention. Because history does not end when it is conquered, it just waits. And with that thought, the night settles back in, the dust cools, the echoes soften, and the story, finally told on its own terms, is allowed to rest. You can let it rest too.